Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Gray Area. I am your host, Zoe Papazoglu, and today's episode is titled, Can a Tree Have Rights? So we have a special episode planned today, diving into what I would call, in my maybe unbiased opinion, one of the most fascinating debates in environmental ethics, the rights of nature, and throughout this podcast, we may reference it as RON. So around the world, countries like Ecuador and New Zealand have taken this bold step of granting legal rights to natural entities, so like rivers and forests, and treating them as legal persons. But could ideas like this ever work here in the United States? And what could happen when ethics, law, and activism collide? So to help me navigate this discussion today, I will be joined by two guests, Lizzie Grafton and Jacob Hutto. So Lizzie, why don't you start us off and introduce yourself and then share some information about what you know of our topic today.
Hi, my name is Lizzie Grafton, and I'm a political science major and mathematics minor here at Lyon. I took environmental politics and policy a few semesters ago, which is when I first learned about the rights of nature debate. I thought this was pretty interesting as when we generally think about natural rights, it's more of human rights rather than nature as a whole.
Awesome. Thanks, Lizzie. And Jacob, what about you?
All right, so hi, my name is Jacob Hutto. I'm an exercise science major. I'm also a very avid outdoorsman. I really enjoy nature and just watching the wildlife and their natural habitat. Actually, so much so that I took a animal behavior course here at Lyon, and I did some research on white-tailed deer. And our topic today, I've never really heard of the rights of nature before, and so I'm really interested in learning from y'all today.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And I'm so glad to have you both on our podcast today with a mixture of some familiarity and some fresh ideas to help make this a great conversation. So I know Lizzie is a little bit more familiar with taking environmental politics with this topic, so some of this background might be a refresher for her. But for Jacob and some of our listeners today, RON might be a completely unique topic. So I'm going to start with some background. So as you've probably noticed, it's not like a new idea. You can scroll through TikTok or Instagram Reels and you've kind of seen some concern for the status of nature. There's been continued environmental degradation, and some of that is human blame. So we kind of can see and look at our tropical rainforest. Over 2/3 of the Earth's tropical rainforests are either lost or severely degraded, which is a really devastating statistic. And then if you look kind of more on like animal extinction, we can see on the IUCN Red List, there's a continued growth as more species become more endangered or extinct. So there's an obvious glaring problem with the status of nature, and so an idea emerged about a possible solution that nature might be better cared for if we could personify it in a way and kind of conceive it more as a rights-bearing person, which led to this creation of RON and our topic of discussion today. But a key criticism that I want to highlight of RON is that it seems that with the framework we currently have, that we only see and protect nature like when it's useful for us or tied to our own inherent interests. So while the focus kind of appears to be on the environment, it's kind of a bit of a distraction because it may be useful to us, and it's also useful to the environment, but we're putting our interests on top of that. So basically, a prominent example that comes to mind is that many state animal cruelty laws. So if you've seen any Criminal Minds episodes, you can kind of see that there's this heavily researched idea that animal cruelty is a precursor for later violence and crime. So even though we may be indirectly helping animals, the main objective might be to deter this sadistic human misconduct, to kind of govern behavior and moral conduct through these state animal cruelty laws. So that leads to my first question for you guys. And what do you guys think about this idea that we view nature mainly through a human lens? And do you kind of see examples of this in your life?
Yeah, I definitely think that there is some truth to this idea that we view nature through a human lens. I mean, basically everything we've built has impacted the environment in some way, whether that just be as simple as cutting down a tree or building a highway across a natural habitat. But I also think that there are some examples of the government taking steps to preserve nature, like passing legislation to create national parks, or something like regulating what waste can be disposed of into natural bodies of water or the environment more generally. And I think while some might argue this is not enough, it does counter the idea that we solely view nature through a lens that puts our needs first.
Yeah, I really see your point about the national park regulation. I think that really helps to show that it might be kind of a mediated interest, but still putting that human lens through it. Jacob, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely also agree that we really use nature primarily just to our advantage whenever we need it. Like the examples, we're building highways across nature that, and we're not really thinking about the repercussions from nature itself. We're mostly thinking about how is this going to impact society? Like whenever you're building buildings, you're most of the time thinking about the structural integrity of your buildings. You're thinking about earthquakes and how nature can affect your buildings, but you're not thinking about how your buildings affect nature.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point of like how it's a one-track mindset with kind of seeing how we can indirectly protect it, but like how is it serving us first? So it's definitely tied to a little bit so of our human interests. So what do you guys think, or how much do you agree that the environment is only protected to the extent that it serves human interest? Or do you think that we're starting to move past that?
I think kind of in general, we have sort of moved past this ideology, but I think that part of the reason underlying the passage of legislation, like I just mentioned, to protect nature, is to prevent disaster to ourselves. If we continuously abused our environment, we would find this has significant repercussions for us, as it's a fact that we need the environment and nature to provide for us. We can't live without it. For example, when we learned about the hole in the ozone layer, there was an international effort to phase out CFCs to allow the hole to replenish itself. And this layer provides important protection for us, and CFCs may not have been phased out if it weren't for the realization that we need it to protect us.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Jacob, what do you think about that?
Yeah, and I also agree. I mean, most of the waterway laws that we've passed is, to help human consumption of water. It's not mostly to preserve the animals and, the ecosystems that live in the waterways. And I feel that at some point we're going to have to move past it in order for humanity to really become part of society. I feel like the Native American culture did a really good job with that, and they lived in tandem with the land, and now I feel like capitalist society just kind of takes advantage of it.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and that kind of moves on to our next perspective of like looking at indigenous worldviews and kind of looking how that can expand how we imagine our relationship with nature. So as you previously mentioned about how there's a very inherent bond between these indigenous worldviews and how they view nature, they kind of personify elements of the natural world, or at least aspects of it. And this reflects the high regard that they hold for nature, as shown with the direct language that they use to reference it. It's very affectionate language. So there's this Ecuadorian idea of Pachamama, which means Mother Earth. So they kind of depict nature as this maternal figure. And when I was looking through the literature, it made me imagine like that disappointed mom look, like when they say like, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. And so like they're kind of seeing nature in that maternal figure lens. And because they're personifying nature in this way, they refrain from this environmentally destructive behavior. So that shows this strong linkage between natural entities and humans. So that leads to my question for y'all, if you think this personification of nature makes people more likely to protect it, and why or why not?
Yeah, I definitely think personification of nature would help people make us more likely to protect it. If, the rights we have as humans and as Americans are a significant foundation of our political and legal system. And I think if we started viewing nature as one of us, which can be done through personification, then it becomes hard to justify not giving the same rights to nature that we have. But this kind of gets into logistical barriers behind this, like how can a tree sue a person, or how do you calculate damages? It's kind of difficult, but I definitely think it would help in a way to pass more things that would protect nature.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about pointing out those weaknesses, and that's definitely something we'll get into later in the podcast for sure.
Yeah, and I would say yes and no to this question. I feel that whenever you interact person to person, that it's a lot easier to understand their struggles and understand, it's kind of like the golden rule, like you don't want to do to others as you want to do to yourself. But with nature, it's really hard for people to personalize it because nature doesn't have a story. Like nature doesn't have I mean, it does, but not an individual. Nature is a overcoming. It's the environment itself isn't a individual. So it's kind of hard for people to see it as one thing. And I feel because of that, a lot of people wouldn't take it seriously.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you both touched on, kind of like a limitation of this personification. And that's why we can also turn maybe to these ethical theories. If you look to Paul Taylor with his biocentric ethics, which is seeing each entity as a teleological center of life, more focusing on the inherent value of each organism. But then you can take Aldo Leopold with his ecocentric ethics, so kind of viewing the ecosystem as a whole, basically focuses on the health and viability of the whole rather than the individual. So it's looking at different ways that we can kind of view nature aside from how we viewed it before with tied to our human interests. So now that we've kind of discussed the background and different lenses that we can view nature through, I wanted to talk more about the rights of nature legal structure. So as you guys both touched on, it's kind of evident that these ethical theories support this rights of nature paradigm, and they offer this moral justification for nature's intrinsic value, that we should protect nature. But there might be some difficulties when we try to translate these statutes into legal phrases. So this kind of might fail the workability test, which a lot of lawyers use, and it's very popular in this legal field. So we're going to talk about three main components of it, and it will be scope and precision, creation of boundaries, and adjudication. So we're going to break all three of these down for the last couple minutes of this episode. So we're going to start with scope and precision. And so in our current legal system, we have this idea that we can use our imagination to create this fictitious person for the purpose of legal protection. So the readily available example is a corporation. We know that corporations are able to be in the court of law, but they're not a person per se, but they're a fictitious person. And so the rights of nature literature attempts to use this reasoning to kind of justify their framework. But this may be an inadequate comparison because there's kind of this lack of precision in RON. There's no law for that a corporation just has rights. The law says details the substantive content of those rights and their limits and their exceptions. But with RON legislation, it's kind of very vague. It's like the right to exist, the right to have habitat, the right to flourish. And what does this really mean? And so when people are kind of lacking this scope and precision, it could lead them down a wrong path. It could trap someone in being kind of negligent because they don't really know what these phrases mean. So an example that I've seen is that there was a due process concerns with Lake Erie's Bill of Rights. And Ohio farmers sued because they had feared that they would be held liable for using this fertilizer in their fields because they didn't know if they were bound from using that due to the legislation because it was so vague. So do you guys think it's even possible to write rights of nature in a precise enough way for U.S. courts, or is this vagueness unavoidable?
I think it's really hard to avoid the vagueness in this. I mean, we still have debates today over constitutional interpretation, even though the document's 200 years old. So it's inevitable that something that is as broad as rights of nature it's going to have vague language if it's implemented.
Yeah, and I theoretically think that there should be a way for biologists to also work with policymakers so they can understand the intricacies of nature a little more instead of trying to use these broad words. But in all reality, policymakers are probably not going to write these laws. There's a lot of pressure from a lot of corporations to, hey, I don't need you to make these laws. We're making money off of this. And then ultimately it's not going to pass until it becomes an issue.
Yeah, I think that's really great points of this limitation. And then we kind of move to our separate second criteria, which is how do we even carve out boundaries? Because under this current system, nature kind of gets protected partially between these other types of acts or in combination of them. But if we implement this R1 system, where do we draw the line? Is it every river has rights, every microbe? Because if you know how we have 8.7 million species, and this could increase exponentially if we're looking at microbial organisms. So, and as we've seen that the courts are already inundated with backlog of cases. So will this make a difference? Would this harm the system more? So where do you guys kind of think about drawing the line? Like, would you draw it at rivers, as species, entire ecosystems? What do you think about that?
So I kind of look at what the U.S. has done before. So they've passed like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And whenever we set boundaries, we have to be very careful so that it's not overbroad or too specific. And when considering major parts of the environment, such as the water or air that the government's done, I think this has made the scope broad yet not too specific that it makes implication impractical and would still benefit the environment more generally with the broad yet not too specific role that these pieces play.
I agree. I feel that this line is hard to draw a definitive line between these sections. I feel like the laws themselves have to be taken individually by each case. I mean, you really can't just draw a line in the sand and say you can't cross this and it'll have no negative impacts. So you really have to take it case by case.
Yeah, I think that's great limitations that you guys pointed out. And then that kind of relates to our final criteria, which is adjudication. And that RON framework is kind of relying on courts to settle these suits, but judges may lack this technical expertise to kind of take a role in addressing these complex environmental harms. Because when you have an endangered species, for example, sometimes you don't know the underlying cause, and it's very difficult to point to something for retribution when you really don't know and can't point to something that's causing it. So we've kind of seen in Ecuador, they've been struggling with this because a judge ruled in this mining project that it didn't violate the rights of nature because the project wouldn't not affect a protected area, but there was a lot of research that showed that this was actually false. So it's kind of going back and forth of like, who has this expertise? Who should make these decisions? Should it be the courts and the judges deciding this? Should we look somewhere else to scientists, agencies, communities? What do you guys think about that?
So we place a lot of faith in judges to properly interpret the law that we do already have. And when it comes to our own legal issues, and without them, our legal system would fall apart. But behind this are the legislators that make the laws that the judges enforce. And this kind of gets into what Jacob was just talking about. It's hard to get the legislators to pass stuff because of special interests that are kind of pushing their decision in a certain way. But if legislators work properly, they're getting opinions of experts and their constituents when making laws. So with proper legislative procedures, judges should be the ones deciding what harms nature. But this does come back to the issue of scope and precision. While scientists and agencies and communities should be able to voice their opinions on what harms nature, I think giving them the power to decide what harms nature and punish actions because of that is unconstitutional. So I would leave it with the judges.
See, I would say that there needs to be a sort of new judge to be formed. I feel like with all the new environmental policies that need to come into place to really protect nature, I feel like some judges should be specialized in this area so they can better understand the decisions that they're making.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you guys both touch on about who can we really decide to make these decisions about what harms nature and what doesn't, because it's a very narrow field with technical expertise, and some scientists and agencies don't even know. So it's something that we still need to continue to work through. And so as we wrap up today about where does this leave us, because we obviously have a need for a new paradigm because of this unprecedented levels of habitat degradation and species loss, but is RON the way? And so because of this workability issues, we have this vague language, we have this inability to establish clear boundaries, the issues with the court level about how to handle this appropriately. It seems that we have this moral desire to protect nature, but it maybe doesn't seem that RON might be this way. So I just want to hear of your final stance on this issue of, do you think that RON could possibly work, or do you think improvements need to be made?
My bottom line in general with rights of nature is that we must protect nature, but it needs to be done in a practical and constitutional way. And it's not a process that needs to be rushed or forced through at the moment. And I think rights of nature overall is really interesting and could work in the United States when some of the kind of issues that would be present when we're implementing it, if those were addressed, then it could really work.
I think that rights of nature could work in the U.S. if we had a more societal change towards our overall protecting nature, because at the end, our government kind of does the will of the people. And if the people have a strong enough will to, go and talk to representatives and push back against, large corporations that are whispering in the ear of your politicians, that we really could get this to work and find ways constitutionally, like Lizzie just addressed, so to really protect nature. Because if we don't, then you're not going to have anything. All of our resources and everything comes from nature, so we have to kind of use like how the Native Americans did and be able to give back to nature.
Yeah, I think that's great points that you guys make about that we should strive to make the environment a higher priority on our list. And I think Rights of Nature is a good start to changing this mindset and kind of looking how we perceive nature. But as you guys both mentioned, there still seems some back to the drawing board of working back through these issues, like the workability issues. So I want to thank you guys both for helping me unpack such a complex and fascinating issue today, and to thank our listeners for tuning in, and let us know what you think if a river should have rights. Until next time, I'm Zoe Papazoglu, and this has been The Gray Area.